just a kind of follow up from the first session on the Agile Digital Leadership approach, which is based on the work of Dr. Simon Breakspear, which again, some of you I'm aware, I went to some of the sessions that have been organised by Education Scotland, or indeed you might have kind of done it through your own professional learning and kind of come across his approach to improvement. So today, what I want to do is to go through, again, just very quickly, some of these approaches, this kind of three-step process of agile improvement. And last time we spoke to you, we spent a bit of time thinking about, clear thinking, about how we take our objective, what we want to do, and really try and dissect that and turn it into, well, what's the impact going to be and what's the change going to be? And it's an iterative process. You can start in any box and you can bring it to tease out the real kind of what it is you're trying to actually do in your improvement journey. Now, again, this isn't unique to digital, but it's a really good way to think about, well, how can we be laser focused on making a positive change for our learners or staff, or indeed both. And again, you'll find that the Clarify Canvas activity should prompt you to kind of really think about, what's the impact going to be, what's the change going to be, what are some of the problems, and really kind of map out, that area that you're in just now. So that activity, if you've managed to kind of do anything with that, has hopefully managed to kind of clarify in your heads what it is you're trying to achieve at a kind of high level, so your high level kind of digital vision, your digital kind of way forward. And that's part of this agile improvement cycle. It's the thinking part of this cycle. And we do that kind of before we do any actions, or then going to figure out, well, how well are we doing those actions? And that was all last week. So last week we talked about that thinking part being part of what it is we're trying to do. And this week and today, we're going to look at, well, what can we do to kind of help make focused progress on those things, and how do we actually know if we've been successful? And that forms part of this cumulative process. Remember, cycles are short periods of time that you define, 6, 8 weeks, a term, half a term, whatever it might be. And you go through this process repeatedly and you learn from the process over and over again. So that thinking phase, we should think about that Clarify Canvas as a tool to really help clarify our thinking, what is we're trying to do, then to act and then monitor. And then at the end of each cycle, we've learned from that process and we start the cycle again. So today we're going to look at the responsive action and lean monitoring side of things. And again, the last time I've done this, it literally kind of days and days worth of kind of learning. So I'm really trying to kind of cut this down into some tools that you might find useful. And again, the reasons why you might want to think about taking this type of approach within your digital improvement journey. So just to begin with, I've got a couple of questions, and again, you'll see there's options to say A, B, or C, D, and you can just type your answer into the chat just to kind of get us into that kind of interaction type mode. So in terms of responsive action, what are some of the things that we can do, and why would we look at doing things a bit differently to make sure that we are able to carry out the tasks that we want to do to see our improvement within digital? So again, in the chat, or indeed stick your hand up if you want to just come in and speak. Think about your experience in improvement in general, and then think about, what it is you want to try and achieve with your digital work. What are some of the things that get in the way of your improvement journey, just in general? So if you want to just have a wee think about that, we've all had improvement plans and we've all set goals, and then things haven't quite worked out the way you want to. But if you think of some of the reasons why they don't work out, that would be great to hear. So if you want to just type something in the chat or stick your hand up, that would be fabulous. Staff confidence levels. Yeah. Composite classes, failing resources. Yeah. Yeah. Change the staff, data protection. Yeah, all these things come in. Yeah. And I'm sure you could list a whole host of other things, staff absences, industrial action get in the way, multiple bank holidays in May. All these things can get in the way of improvement. And sometimes we don't think about those things before we start an improvement journey, and it causes us to stall and stagger and not get to where we want. So part of the responsive action approach is to make sure we think about, well, just before we start, let's think about, what could be the pitfalls, so we can think about how we might mitigate those things. And some of them are really difficult, really challenging things to go over. The data protection stuff is a legal thing, that's really, really challenging to get through sometimes. Resource-wise, well, we know we've got a few resources. Maybe we need to think about how we best leverage the resources we have. All those things that I'm sure you've all had conversations about before, but just keeping that in mind can be quite useful to help us kind of move forward with our planning. And then because of that, it gets us to get stuck, and we kind of can't move forward. So if you end up getting stuck because we have these challenges, what happens to you and the team that are trying to move ahead with that improvement? What does it feel like when you get stuck and stalled? What happens in your school? Again, just a wee sentence in the chat would be great. Frustration, deflated, yeah, frustration, frustration, morale, yep, confusion for parents, brilliant. Well, not brilliant, but again, we all see these things happening. Tried that before. I know. It's so it becomes really, really challenging. It becomes really challenging when we've got these great ideas of what we want to do. We're aware there are problems, and sometimes we won't really kind of mitigate them very well. And then everyone involved goes, "Oh, again, what's happening?" And we've not managed to do what we want to do, and it can get really challenging. It can get really challenging. So some of the things we want to think about, that's why this is my last kind of question, is that when you have your improvement project, you're aware of those problems and challenges. We know if we don't do it right, our staff and us get kind of deflated. But then because of all those things, you think about, well, what's the cause of all that? And what Simon Breakspear suggested, he said there's 5 things that um, kind of get in the way of our own kind of improvement work when we do it traditionally. And those are listed on the screen there, A to E. So you struggle to break down a big project, we take on too much, things interrupt our flow, what we're trying to do, but become unclear about who's doing what and what my responsibilities, and then things just overrun, time, kind of visual lose time. And again, if you just do A, B, C, D, or E, or all of them, if I just note some of those letters in the chat, have you experienced these things on any of the improvement work that you've done before, whether it be, on the Raising Attainment or the Scottish Attainment Challenge, or if it's the introduction of a new platform in your school? Have you experienced any of those things within improvement before? So A, B, C, D, E in the chat would be great to hear that. E, things overrun. I think most of us can have experienced that. All of them at some point. Yep. B and C. Yeah. So again, I would imagine that all of us have experienced bits of these. All of these, we're seeing like B and C come up, E and C coming up quite a lot. So that in itself, that's because we've tried historically to go through this process of improvement, which generally starts, here's our school improvement plan. And by the end of the year, or in 3 years' time, we want to be at this point here. But all this time passes in between, and loads of stuff gets in the way. Things happen and get in the way. And it means that sometimes when we kind of look at what we want to do compared to what we actually do, there's a big gulf there. And there's lots of pitfalls and ups and downs on the way. And that traditional way of school improvement can sometimes hinder us in terms of things like morale and all those things. So the agile approach lets us, break things down into smaller time periods and be much more responsive, and allow us to course correct and change direction when problems come up. Allows us to take time to celebrate successes more frequently. It allows us to focus on what's most important in smaller timescales. And the way that we can do that is to use something called a rapid action plan. So a rapid action plan, again, it sounds really, really straightforward. And I'm sure, again, it's things that you've it won't be unfamiliar to you. But the process of rapid action planning and then the following little stand-up kind of meetings that you can arrange afterwards can really help us kind of narrow our focus for a small period of time, be laser focused on particular priorities, and then regular kind of frequency about saying, okay, what is it that is how well are things going? Do we need to make any changes? What are we going to do next? And having those more frequent kind of informal meetings, almost like that kind of semi-formalized chat you have in the staff room with someone else who might be working with you, allows us to kind of be more successful within shorter periods of time on smaller pieces of work that cumulatively get to the stage of your final kind of target. So what I'd like to do is just illustrate a couple of ways we can do rapid action planning. And again, it's based on 5 principles essentially. Those things should be, first of all, is to make sure that we're not doing everything. So in the first instance, let's say we want to improve the digital literacy of all our learners or the digital skills of all our staff. That's a massive statement. That's a huge thing to try and do, and trying to break that can be really challenging. So actually, do we need to really kind of, in that first instance, really kind of break down, define and chunk up and constrain what it is we're trying to achieve? So let's think about, actually, let's drill down to smaller pieces of work. Let's set a kind of narrower scope and boundaries for our first cycle. Then within that, we can break up that smaller target into little chunks. So in order to be successful in that, what we're going to break that up into. So if you're doing things like, let's say you want to increase the use of accessibility tools for learners and staff, because you want to make sure all your learners for ASN are kind of catered for, but also all your learners are aware of how to use that and all the parents know that those tools are available. That's a constraint, it's a box. You then have to take that task and break that down into its individual components to be successful. Then figure out, well, in order to kind of do this, which ones are we going to prioritize first? So in the first instance, just choose two or three of those little chunks that you've created and focus purely on them. And then monitor what we're doing, figure out, are we actually meeting those little individual targets? And if we're not, we can change direction, we can course correct, because we don't have to wait until the end of the year to kind of make a decision about, well, that didn't work, so let's try something else. We can say, well, actually, this isn't working because of this. Let's address that now. We can do it in a much shorter time scale on a much smaller project. It allows us not to kind of veer off track or to get stuck. And then it also gives us time to say, well, because it's a smaller piece of work, then we can take the time to actually celebrate our achievements. And then we can start again. You go, okay, now we've done this, then we can start again. So that's the whole kind of principles of rapid action planning in that nutshell. So for your digital improvement project, what we should try and do is, if you, in the first instance, so in the PowerPoint slides that I've shared in the chat, which you can download from Did You Learn Scott, I want you to kind of, or even on a bit of paper, is think about a set of tasks that are important for your digital improvement journey. And I've got an example of one we did with Perth and Ross a few weeks ago. And this is just one of the DHTs who were there, who was leading the, essentially they were moving from Google to a Microsoft platform. And that was going to be a bit of a project they had to do, but you had to be done really quickly. So for that particular project, this person identified the following things that had to be done in order to kind of make those changes, to make those things. So in order for you guys to do this, previously it would have a bit longer time, and I would maybe go into a breakout room and do this, and you could do it via discussion. But if you want to just even open up that PowerPoint slide that I've sent you, and you could just start typing in there some of the individual actions you need to do for your smaller piece of work within your digital improvement journey, and just start to list them out. They don't have to be in any order, but just things just that need to happen in order to do that. I'll just give you a minute. Just, you can even write it on a bit of paper. So if you at the top, just say, what is you trying to do, and just put down some bullet points of individual things are going to have to be taken care of in order for that small piece of work to be successful. And it doesn't have to be in any order, just any way you want. So I'll give you a minute or so to think about that. No worries, Angela. Thank you. Again, if you join us a little bit later, just pop the link in to the chat again. So as I say, it's a PowerPoint slide there that you can download, and the first slide has just an empty page where you just jot down your ideas, your chunks, what things have to be taken care of in order for your little project, the smaller part of your project to be successful. So what you're essentially doing at this point is creating a backlog, a log of work of things that need to be taken care of in order to be successful. Okay. And again, we've got until 10:30, and I'm conscious that there's quite a bit to go through in this 1 hour session. So hopefully you've managed to put 3 or 4 things down there. And if you're going to keep that as like on the side and add to it as we go along, that's absolutely perfect. So once you have this kind of list of deliverable kind of chunks or tasks you want to do, it sounds crazy to kind of say this out loud, but again, sometimes we don't do this as thoroughly as we maybe should. But if you take your list of chunks and tasks like this one here, so there's 8 little tasks here that have to be done. What we suggest you do is again, to make you feel about that you're successful, you can complete it, it's visual, it's there. We take the most important 3 tasks. So from your list of chunks, you identify the most important 3. So what are the 3 most important ones that have to be done? And then we put them into a rapid action plan. And a rapid action plan is completely similar to things you've done before. But what it asks us to do is ask us to be much more precise about things like who's doing what and what is the time scale. But asks us to also consider, resources, and also what problems might occur for that particular task and what can we do to kind of mitigate those problems. So by taking into account all of the things we know about improvement and digital and challenges and the resources that we have available to us, our staff and our digital support from the council or from national bodies or whoever it might be, we can kind of be but much more specific about what we need to do in order to achieve the smaller task. So again, if I take this person's activity and highlight what they identified as their most important 3 chunks, it looked a bit like this. So this person identified 3 things that had to be done, then went down to be quite specific about who's going to do what. And when it's personal, you should try and actually put people's names against things. But because this was put on a kind of a public type forum, that's why the names say me, DHT, and things like that. But if you're planning with your planning team in the school, put people's names against it, as in who can be contacted. Be specific about your time frames. Think about the resources, the bandwidth that's needed in order to carry out that task. Then identify any issues or problems that might happen in order to complete that task. Then think about ways how you might mitigate that. So because when you have that type of plan, it means that we're then able to be much more we can much what I'm trying to say, we can monitor the progress much more accurately. And it means that if we are preparing for a potential disruption, we can maybe think about ways to mitigate that earlier on, as opposed to having to wait for weeks and weeks and weeks and months. So again, on the PowerPoint slides that I sent you, slide 2, I've just put in a really small table that kind of takes your ideas about kind of says, based on your projects, your chunks, what are the first 3 things you need to tackle and who's going to do that and what's the time frame and what support and resources are going to be required, and then what might get in the way and how might we change that. If you spend a bit of time teasing that out for your first reactions, then all of a sudden you've got a much more um, actionable plan that you can say, well, actually, now I know who's doing what and when, I know what might get in the way, and I'm going to plan to catch up with these people on a fairly frequent basis and just see how they're going. Okay, so again, I'll just give you again another kind of couple of minutes. You might want to take one of your deliverable chunks and just maybe fill in that first line, just to kind of go through the process. And again, if this was a longer session, we'd be spending much more time discussing these things and you being able to kind of flesh out in a bit more detail what your rapid action plan might look like. Did you come in there, Jim? No, I thought I heard someone's voice there.
I just added a picture of that slide you're talking about.
All right, lovely. Thank you. Thank you. And again, you can just do it on a bit of paper as well if you want. The idea being you go from a list of chunks for your current cycle, your targets for your current cycle, the list of tasks you want, identify 3 and break them down into who's doing what, when we're going to do it, what resources are required, and what challenges one might face and how it might get in the way. And spending that time planning will hopefully, resolve the some of the challenges that we see in improvement. It's not going to fix the DPIA thing, it's not going to fix the resources thing, but the other things that get in the way that might be challenging for us. So again, I remember when I was doing the professional learning that goes along with Simon Breakspeare's course, and doing these activities, and I think to myself, well, none of this is really new, but it's framed in a way that was perhaps fresh, a different way to really think about improvement, and really trying to get the mindset into cyclical improvement over shorter periods of time. And if anything that comes from these sessions, I think that mindset is probably most important, about kind of not kind of trying to do things over months and months and years, but trying to do smaller things on the road to your bigger vision. And these types of activities lets us stay more focused and allows us to monitor and track better our progress, and allows us to celebrate successes more frequently as well. So once you've done that, again, I know you won't have done all that by now, so it's a huge thinking job. It's not just to be done by one person alone, but that's a way to think about identifying your priorities within your current improvement cycle. And what a lot of schools do is that they want to make this visible to the people in the team, to the staff, or whoever they do. And one of the approaches that can be done for that is to use a Kanban board. Now, I don't know if you've seen Kanban boards, but essentially what they are, they're just visual representations of the work that you're doing just now. And it's usually split into 3 columns, what we need to do, what we're currently doing, and what we've done. And we've seen examples of these things in like primary schools, where it's like on the staff room wall, where all those little deliverable tasks that you've got, they become your list of things you're going to do, and you visually move them from this is what we need to do, to this is what we're doing, to this is what we've done. And things can move backwards and forwards. You might have things that are in the doing column, but you realise, because you're meeting frequently and talking things frequently, it needs to go back to the to-do column, and something else takes its priority. But the more you've managed to move your individual chunks to the right-hand side, the more easy it is to celebrate success and kind of be vocal about how much we've achieved in that period of time. So again, if you have never used a Kanban board before, it literally could be bits of paper on the staff room wall or in an office wall and post-its, or you might want to think about a digital approach with some tools, things like Miro and Google Jamboard and Padlet and those virtual kind of post-it things. They all work, but there's something about, making something visible to your staff and to learners and parents to kind of say this is our improvement journey. And again, I'm sure it's not new to a lot of people, but just seeing it all packaged up in this way can be really quite motivating for everyone. So you can see the links that start to form from taking your current cycle of work and breaking that down into individual chunks, prioritizing your chunks, and then visually seeing the progress of that by kind of making that kind of public statement about success, for want of a better word. Now, again, that could be done on paper or it could be done digitally with some of the tools that might be available to you. And again, benefits of both. You could do both if you want. There we go. But the good thing about using that Kanban board type approach is that it means that your list of tasks become your kind of backlog and they can move into this is what we need to do next activity during your cycle. Then as your cycle moves on, you make a point to catch up with the people that you've identified on your rapid action plan. So, well, how are things going? And this isn't the idea of having like, a formal digital learning team meeting once every 6 weeks for an hour at lunchtime. It's not as formal as that, but it's more formal than just a kind of 2-minute chat in the classroom. The best stand-up activities tend to be very short and very focused, and they tend to last about kind of 10-15 minutes, and it gives an opportunity for yourself and other members team to come together and ask ourselves 3 questions. What have we done? What we're stuck with? And what should we do next? And by doing that, it means that people, but by planning for that and putting like a time in the diary to have that 15-minute catch up, stand up, whatever it might be, it means that the people who are involved in the improvement process know that they've got to go to this stand up meeting and be able to speak about kind of the work that they're doing, but without having to do formal minutes or big reports. It's generally just coming in to share kind of this is what we've done, this is what we're stuck with, and what we're doing next. And what it lets you do is at those points, it lets us do that thing, saying, well, we can see there's a problem here, so let's slightly change direction because of what you've said there. And by making the stand-up process a kind of timetabled formal part of that improvement cycle, it lets everyone be accountable, but also lets everyone celebrate more frequently and together. So for example, if your improvement cycle is 8 weeks, you might put in a stand-up at week 2 and a stand-up at week 5 to catch up with those things. And again, small formal things, small informal yet scheduled meetings, because when it's in your calendar, if it's there, the people involved in going to that meeting have to be prepared, have to come in and say, this is what we've done, this is what we haven't done, which is more formal than the staff room chat, but less formal than the long meetings that require minutes and all that type of thing. It's meant to kind of try and mitigate some of the challenges we have on those improvement journeys when we get stuck and lose morale or things don't work, and keeping those things up. But again, I'm sure this isn't a new concept to everyone. So the whole process of lean monitoring is about responsive action, is about the planning and identification of tasks, people, resources, understanding where there might be challenges and planning for how you might kind of fix those challenges should they come up, then putting in place something visual, something public that kind of that celebrates success and progress on a frequent basis, and then catching up with those involved in the entire project on a frequent basis as well. And if things go wrong, that's okay. We can take time and course correct and change direction. So rapid action planning as part of responsive action can be a really useful tool. So for your digital project, for your digital journey, perhaps you're trying to achieve the Digital Schools Award, perhaps you're trying to improve accessibility, use of digital tools for learners. Perhaps it's about integrating coding in a progressive way from primary 1 to primary 7. whatever that big thing is, let's start to break down into individual chunks. So what do we need to do? And again, really happy to help support those conversations on a more kind of one-to-one basis. This is very much the kind of agile mindset improvement kind of methodology we're talking about today. So it's difficult to get into individual conversations in this forum, but really happy to kind of have follow-up conversations should we need. No worries, Christine. Okay, so in a nutshell, that was responsive action about kind of, I say, gathering together our tasks, resources, people, figuring out who needs to do what, when they need to do it, and then making sure we spend time to kind of monitor and celebrate kind of those things. But after that, we then have to think about, well, how do we get better at knowing how if we've been successful, you know? And that third part of the agile process is termed lean monitoring. Okay, so lean monitoring, again, it's meant to try and take the, I suppose, the challenges away that we sometimes have when we say, well, how do we know that we've been successful? What evidence do we have that we've been successful? That whole thing. And quite often that generates lots of paperwork and all this, which, you know, is important for a lot of improvement work. You know, I'm not taking away the kind of end of year reports and all that type of stuff, but talking throughout the process of improvement between cycles, in cycles, how do we know we're being successful? And again, a couple of things I'd like to share here, one of which in particular, I think is probably the most useful thing that I find from this process. Now, the Clarify Canvas activity, I think, is great. I think there's the responsive action planning works really well if you've got lots of people involved in the project. But this next part, I think, is the most useful, and it's about kind of looking at how it's about looking at impact. And I think that can be quite challenging for a lot of people and for us in schools to kind of spend time to be able to really articulate impact. And this, I think, can be quite useful. So again, as part of that think, act, monitor process, we've got the thinking with the Clarify Canvas activity about what we're trying to do. We've got the acting on the individual tasks through that process of rapid action planning and having regular stand-ups. So the monitoring bit is about kind of, well, how do we know what impact that we're making? So again, I'm going to jump, I suppose, more to the kind of the activity part, which I think is the most useful. So I'm going to talk about this impact map. So traditionally, what we want to do is we should be looking at, you know, in one cycle, if we do things like, if we do this, if we do this thing, then first we should see these changes happening with our learners or staff. And then a bit later on, we should see the following things happening with our learners and staff. Okay, because traditionally, when we do improvement planning or any sort, we kind of say, here's our implementation strategy that says, right, we're going to do this. If we do these things, we expect this to be the outcome. So if we do these things, eventually we're going to see this. And I know I've certainly been part of schools and faculties and SLT where, you know, a lot of that's great. And I think for, you know, school vision and long-term strategy, that's great. However, the bit in between is the bit where sometimes, you know, our journey kind of, we expect our journey to go, if we do this, we're going to get to the final outcome and that's it. But in reality, what tends to happen is that whole thing where, oh my goodness, what's going on and all that type of stuff. We end up doing something like this and our outcome sometimes miles away from where we start. So what an impact map lets us try and do is it lets us say, well, okay, in shorter periods of time between our implementation strategy and our final outcome, what can we expect to see in between those? And the term is leading indicators and lagging indicators. And I find this, I think, the most interesting about that kind of way to look at impact over time. So if you have a look at this, instead of seeing it as, you know, happening per cycle, the leading and lagging indicators happen after alternative cycles in the way that says, well, because our improvement work is the cyclical nature, you know, short period of work, you do some work, we do the learning, then we move on to the next phase and think, act, do the work, do the learning. So at the end of each of those cycles, we should expect to see some improvement somewhere, with our learners, with our staff, whatever group it is that we are dealing with. So can we spend some time thinking about, okay, in my improvement project, what would our leading and lagging indicators look like over more than one cycle? So to give this a bit of context, I've taken, again, a bit of inspiration from a previous session that we did around about this. So there was one group of people who narrowed down their improvement focus for this next little while was about the learner's experience with accessibility tools. And then we got to think about, well, what does that mean for staff and what does that mean for learners? And at the end of our first cycle, what do we expect to see? And at the end of our second cycle, what would we expect to see based on the implementation strategies that we have? So, for example, for our implementation strategies for that target of improving learning experience using accessibility tools, and I'm listing down there the things that we're going to do, back from those little chunks and maps. These are the things that we're going to do to help meet our kind of target up there, which is improving that accessibility tools for staff. We've got kind of planned activities, and we've got resources and da. So at the end of our first cycle, our kind of 6 weeks or 8 weeks, what we've done at the end of that cycle, what do we expect to see for our staff? What behaviours and changes should we see in our staff? And we kind of list down, this is what we might expect to see these things. And then after that, though, after that first cycle, what should we be seeing for our staff? And you might kind of say, well, actually, once our staff are more confident in using it and be able to, we expect that our staff are actually able to spend more time doing the kind of supporting learners in class because the learners are more able to support themselves. But we expect to see those things happening in class. So actually, spending a bit of time looking at your indicators of success over shorter periods and how they cumulatively develop, I personally find like a really useful activity to try and do. So that's one way to do it. And you think about the impact on staff, but again, this particular one would have an impact on learners. And again, the implementation strategy for the learner would no, considerably it would be the support for the staff. So what support are the staff getting? So when we look at the learners one, you may not have implementation strategies for learners. You might, but you might not. But again, if all our staff are doing these things, what types of improvements should we see, or what types of behaviours should we see in our learners after this is doing? So again, you would do the same thing and think, well, actually, if all our staff are more confident in accessibility tools and our learners are more confident with accessibility tools, what should we begin to see? And you maybe list the things that you'd expect to see there for your learners. And then after your second cycle, what would you expect to see? And again, once you're able to identify those things, all of a sudden it means that when it comes to the parts of the stand-up meetings, or it comes to the end of that cycle and you're celebrating the success, you've got some measures that you can use to say, well, actually, are we seeing these things? And then we can plan to go and say, well, how might we gather some evidence of that? What does that evidence look like? And it could be that it's all based on, walking a classroom and observing this behavior, or you're seeing a higher quality of written work coming from pupils because the accessibility tools are allowing more engagement with text. You're seeing more independent learning happening because the teachers don't have to come and support, or learning systems don't have to come and support individual pupils. All those things that you can visually type see. So if you spend a bit of time with your idea of your digital vision, your improvement chunk for this cycle, if you then follow that on and say, well, what do we expect this to look like for our staff and our learners if we do the things that we say we would? It can be a really, really useful exercise in order to try and figure out, are we being successful? And by doing it beforehand, you're taking away a lot of the time it takes for that evaluation piece, for kind of formal writing and things like that. So again, on the PowerPoint slides that I've sent. I've literally put a blank version of those slides on there. And again, feel free to just click in the box and start typing. But if you've got a bit of paper, you can put the headings down and write down. But if you think about the improvement journey that you want to take with digital, and you've got a chunk, a piece of work that you know you want to do, can you try and exemplify and take an idea of, well, after 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever your cycle length you've decided for the first one, what changes would you expect to see, behaviours you expect to see from your staff and from your learners? And then after the second cycle, what does that then look like? What does that cumulative improvement look like? So you might want to take, I would say, 3 or 4 minutes just to kind of identify some of those things for your particular improvement project. We can then talk a little bit about how we can then go and gather evidence for that, which will take us to about 20 past. Then we'll get you guys to come in. So again, if you've got that PowerPoint, you might want to just type in the top where it says impact map for staff, just put in what it is you're trying to do, and then just click on the boxes underneath where it says, on your presentation, it says these things, this, then this. You can just click in there and you can type, well, if we do these things, if we do this, 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 first of all, we'd expect to see this from our staff, and then later on, we'd expect to see that. Okay, so again, you hope had a wee shot of thinking about your leading and lagging indicators. And again, perfectly aware that this is such a short period of time that to get into any depth might be really challenging. But again, really happy to come and have further conversations with you as a school or a group of practitioners in your school who are leading on this digital thing. We could really tease out and look at this whole rapid action planning and lean monitoring as a tool to help kind of develop and move forward with your digital journeys. So the final thing I wanted to kind of mention today is that once we've done this idea of our impact map and we kind of know what we expect to see when it comes to our particular digital implementation, our improvement implementation, and we've got our cycles planned out for these first 8 weeks, the next 8 weeks, and whatever those things might be. At the end of each of those different activities, if we can prepare for, gathering that evidence so we know that things are correct, one way to do that is to kind of predetermine what it is you want to collect. And again, this is one that I think it's useful. I think it's one of those things that I think is it's a time-saving thing. Um, and you may or may not find this suitable for the job that you're doing. But the principle behind a data capture card is to make sure that you essentially kind of what evidence looks like in your school, and you know what evidence sources looks like in your school. So essentially, if you create a little template beforehand, like, and then list the ways that you generically capture evidence or get evidence from your any improvement process. So in the ones we've got listed here, it's like the student assessment data, we've got the a pulse check survey, we've got a whole list of things there. These are the ones that were that are suggested from Simon Breakspear. And I think if you look at those things, you probably relate to all of them. But the idea about doing this at the same time as your impact map is that if you've created your impact map that says this is what we expect to see, this is the sort of behaviours and things we expect to see, and then we can then plan to use a data capture card to say, well, actually, for each of those different things, planning in advance. So for example, uh, the attitudes of staff in using accessibility tools and their confidence and uh, the amount of independent learning that learners now are now able to carry out because they're confident using the accessibility tools. Whatever the leading and lagging indicators you've picked are the important measures. You can then essentially just kind of note down at the side. So, well, actually, I'm going to do a survey here, and I'm going to use observation. I'm going to use my attainment data, and by kind of planning ahead for knowing what you want to collect in order to evidence your impact, it can be a really useful tool. And I think that sometimes this is the bit that we often leave to the last minute about kind of know the gathering of that evidence. So actually planning for gathering evidence at that kind of earlier stage, and if you've got preset ways of capturing particular types of things, you can kind of fill out that form as part of that monitoring process. When it comes to having a stand-up meeting, if it comes to the end of the year and you want to generate evidence, perhaps you've got a thematic inspection coming in or whatever it might be, you've got this kind of really robust set of plans and measures that you can say, well, this is what we're going to do, this is how we've done it, and this is the evidence we have for that. And again, this planning sheet, this impact map, and then the data capture card is just a way to kind of match up your expectations to what evidence you have for that. So they kind of set in your measures so they are actually measurable, if that makes sense. Because sometimes we say, oh yeah, we'll see an increase in engagement, but then how do you actually measure that? So think about how you measure it beforehand makes your life a bit more straightforward when it comes to actually talking about how well you've succeeded there. I realised I didn't put that slide on my presentation there, but again, it'd be the same type of thing. You would maybe have a look at the approaches that you use to gather data, to gather evidence, and use that as a template and make sure that as you go along, as you develop your impact map, your ideas, you're kind of planning for gathering evidence to a certain extent. It doesn't have to be massively, massive kind of tombs and tombs of documentation. It just has to be kind of, well, we'll do a survey and I'll make sure I'll do that. It helps us kind of do those things in order to complete a circle before we move on to the next activity. Folks, that is 25 past 10. That's a huge whirlwind tour of the Agile process from Simon Breakspear, which I would thoroughly recommend you can have a look at some of his works. He goes into it much more eloquently and more detailed than I am. But those practices, those 3 agile practices of clear thinking, excuse me a second, I was not changing slides back to where I wanted to go to. Those 3 agile processes, agile steps, those principles, clear thinking, responsive action, and lean monitoring, there are tools that have been shared or strategies that have been shared with you over the last kind of couple of sessions, which I say, I'm sure they're not new to y'all, but I think the important thing about this is about changing that mindset to being from plan now, carry things out over a long period of time, and then get to your outcome. By changing the mindset to move into that cyclical approach of improvement, particularly in the area of digital, where things can change all the time, will allow us to hopefully mitigate those challenges that we've seen in previous improvement journeys, the things like kind of frustration and morale and all those things. If we know, if we're planning for what we know over short periods of time, then it's likely to be more successful because we're not waiting for such long periods to see an end result. Again, it's more of a mindset change. Some of these strategies you might not be fussed about. You might not want to use any templates, and all that's fine. But I would urge you to move towards a more cyclical, shorter periods of improvement as you are trying to change or implement some digital improvement in your school, because of the nature of the digital landscape, because of the nature of how we know improvement works and the pitfalls that we can have. I think it's a really interesting model to explore. And again, I'd be really happy to work with you on a more one-to-one basis if you wanted to kind of tease out some of those things. It'd be really good for us to kind of see any impact of that, and to see if these processes are actually making a difference to you in how you go about improvement for digital, or indeed any other improvements that you're doing. So I'm going to stop talking there, but I'm really happy to take any questions or comments. Totally conscious that's such a short period of time and a lot of information to come out there. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen, but I'm really happy to take questions, comments, or whatever it might be.
Brian, can I just say thanks very much indeed for your input this morning. Thanks very much as well, Louise. From a Love Learning team perspective, really interesting to hear about some of the barriers that colleagues on the meeting today have identified, around resourcing, GDPR, staff confidence levels, the lack of hardware that I suppose ties into resourcing. Another key one as well, those competing school priorities, and I think inequity of access came up as well as the need for parental engagement. So that's a lot of food for thought for us as a team. Really liked the information that you've given us around implementation strategies. Your leading indicators, your lagging indicators, and really liked that data capture card that, as you say, is kind of like a short cycle model. And one of the things that we've been really promoting and pushing across schools in Aberdeenshire is the need for a drive towards being data-rich schools as part of the improvement process. So that was really good to hear and really interesting. And also as well, thank you very much for that offer of one-to-one support if required. And I'm pretty sure that there'll be a few schools who'll be keen to get in touch and to tap into that support. So thanks very much indeed.
No, I think I really would be delighted to. I think that just having someone to to speak with that's perhaps kind of comes from out with your kind of local area. It's almost like having that, not a critical friend, but someone to kind of just bounce ideas off and help with that kind of planning, action, monitoring process. I think could be quite a useful thing. From my perspective, we've invested. I've invested quite a bit of time in trying to figure out what that agile approach looks like, and I'd be really keen to develop my skills in a school context, because just now I'm sitting at Education Scotland, and seeing what that's like in a school is difficult when you're not actually doing it with a school. So if there was any schools in that would like to kind of have a wee conversation about how we could maybe do some work on that agile approach for digital change, I'd be really interested to kind of work alongside them. Can't do every school in Scotland, just FYI, but I can certainly kind of take a couple of hours every so often to kind of have that sounding board and conversation.
We've got a few folk I think who'll maybe post into the the chat bar there, so we can get Jim and myself to make contact with them and see if we can set something up. So that's brilliant.
It'd be great. And again, just thinking ahead, because as I say, it's just a different mindset, I suppose, to compare to that traditional school improvement. We know that the whole kind of long periods of time, but actually just planning for short-term improvement. Sorry, short-term cumulative improvements that build up to a final thing. So if you're doing your Digital Schools Award, for example, if you're just to focus on little things at a time, all of a sudden you would get your Digital Schools Award because you're tackling, digital skills with learners, your accessibility and cyber resilience. You tackle the little bits at a time, and all of a sudden, cumulatively, they build up to your Digital Skills Award, technically. So, but yes, anyway, I'm going to stop talking there, but I'm happy to get any more questions.
Thanks very much, Brian. And just to say to all the colleagues who have joined us this morning and meeting too, thank you very much indeed for your time. I know how very busy you are, and hopefully you've got some real food for thought here in terms of your focus and your planning and your improvement planning around digital. I'll need to scoot off, Brian, because I've got a meeting at 10:30, but I'll leave you in Jim's capable hands just in case you've got any questions from the chat bar and from colleagues who are still on the call. Thanks very much indeed.
Cheers. So I'm happy to stick around until everyone's left. Hold the door open.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah.
Lovely. Thanks for the comments, folks. I love that. Really nice feedback. Thank you very much. As I say, a lot of information in a short period of time. Again, just to reiterate, it's not my work. It's the work of Simon Breakspear that I've appropriated for this digital course.
Well, I'm quite glad you did it, Brian, because I had a quick check there at 990 Australian dollars per session. It was quite.
I know.
It's quite expensive. Yeah.
It is. But again, I say it was like a 3-day course, and it's really good. And as you probably recognise a lot of things there, Jim. That's not a lot of it isn't new. It's about kind of just reframing in that kind of cyclical approach, which I think is quite nice.
That's good. Well, everybody seems to be going, and no questions to be asked. So that was good. Yeah, there we go. That was good. Thanks very much, Brian. Oh, there's Martin. Hello, Martin. So
Hi,
that was fine. I think was that the last one in the series, or is there another one? I thought
so.
This was
it is. So this is the last one because so previously, there's the kind of introductory session, which is about the kind of framing, kind of what your leadership goal might be. And then previously, I've done a session on clear thinking, a session on responsive action, and a session on lean monitoring. I've done 3, but we did clear thinking last time, and I was asked to put the two responsive action and lead monitoring together. So that's why there was so much stuff. A
lot of information, and
not a lot of and not a lot of interaction. So again, previously what I've done is I've done like the responsive action thing, and we've had a bit of time in breakout rooms, and people have gone away and they've tried to kind of do their kind of rapid action plan examples, and we just tried to kind of spend a bit more time going through some of that kind of conversational tools process. And then did the same for the lean monitoring thing. So people tended to leave with stuff, with the Jamboard full of stuff. Whereas this one I had to just go through very, very quickly. So
that was fine though. It was and it's good because it can apply to when you actually listen to what you're saying and look at it, it can apply to actually anything. That's the beauty of it.
That's exactly kind of that whole thing, is that the agile approach is for improvement just in general, but I'm trying to put it into people's ideas context. That their digital improvement, because I think it really works because it's such a ever-changing landscape. So saying things, we're going to do this by the end of the year, and all of a sudden something happens out with your control that causes that not to happen, but this allows you to change direction and not